Hello, everybody. My name is Barbara Gödecke. I'm one of the experts in autonomous language learning at the Language Center of the University of Padua, and I'm here to welcome you to the February edition of this academic year's 9 Months, 9 Universities, the series of online lectures organized within the framework of Working Group 11 of the Arqus European Alliance. The Arqus Alliance brings together 9 universities who share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives, a common vision of the role of higher education and research and mutual fields of interest. Together, the partner universities are building an innovative and inclusive approach to education, to research, and to innovation. Working Group 11 is the plurilingual and intercultural hub of the Alliance and aims to promote plurilingualism and to foster intercultural competences amongst the Alliance's universities. The webinars of the series 9 Months, 9 Universities are intended to generate awareness and appreciation for the topic of multilingualism and interculturalism and an understanding of the many areas of our lives that are related to and influenced by language. The webinars focus on specific topics related to language and culture and target mainly graduate and postgraduate students as well as early stage researchers and all the staff interested in those topics. Let me now introduce you to today's speaker from the University of Wrocław, Maciej Litwin. The focus of Professor Litwin's research is on the problem of economy in translation theory, and his present work turns to changes to the figure of the translator resulting from the technological revolution, as well as the problem of translator trust. Before joining the academia, Maciej was the Wrocław City Hall liaison for university business government relations, the regional co-coordinator of the OECD review of higher education in regional and city development, as well as part of the mayor of Wrocław's advisory board for education. Today's webinar, Call Back the Dragoman, theoretical, philosophical, and historical comments on the language and translation narrative in the age of AI, will discuss the evolving landscape of professional translation in the digital age and explore how the role of translators has transformed from the 1960s vision of linguistic experts to today's challenges posed by AI and large language models. The talk will also touch on potential future directions for the translation profession, including a broader approach to translation and a renewed focus on trust, offering valuable insights into the changing nature of language expertise in our increasingly AI-driven world. Just one last thing before I will hand over the screen. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment box and I'll pass them over to the speaker at the end of his talk. So, Maciej, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And now the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Wrocław. Everyone is enjoying the first moments of spring here today. So there's a lot of activity in many gardens. We're busy talking about translation and language on a Friday morning. So we need to have good reasons for it. And the reasons are certainly there. So the reason why I thought it's a good moment to have that reflection moment, to have the reflection in this discussion, that's because there are many hectic discussions in the broadly understood translation community. Just a couple of years ago, when you looked at the outlooks in the industry, there was a lot of optimism. 2019, well, machine translation would have registered as a factor in surveys, but there was a clear expectation of growth for the entire language profession. Fast forward 6 years, that talk is about the structural change, the balance between technology and human services being broken, small language companies and professionals being particularly hard hit by the changes. So all of this requires attention. And of course, when you go to cafeterias, coffee breaks, wherever, at conferences, AI keeps popping up, not in every conversation, but in many of them. And there is a lot of noise around this topic. So how do we even strip out information on AI from noise? How do we take these questions, such as, well, is this just a reshaping of translation and the language profession, or is it something else? How robust are our arguments in place in the future? So, for instance, defending human translation on grounds of extraordinary or singular human creativity. And finally, what about the prospects of the profession when it comes to the labor market and the disruption now taking place? Now, there are measured and focused responses already. This is an example of one, a book which I think is really highly recommended. And we'll come back to the argument put in this book later. But basically, the response is we're facing a new era, not the end. And there are strands of discussion which are promising and will be pursued. Some of them are not that new, others are rather new. So downward migration as the future for most translators, but that should coincide with a re-asserted role in premium markets. So there is this creativity argument behind it. There is a discussion of rethinking basic translator skills to make it fit the human-machine interface, the production cycle, which has been substantially transformed. And then finally, there's also talk about recontextualizing translation training. If you look at the cover of this book, it's already there. It's generative AI and machine translation in language learning and translator training. Now, what I find interesting is that for a long time in the 20th century, language learning and translator training were considered to be not necessarily things apart, but separate things. Now they're in the same title. Now, what do these realignments mean for the theoretical work on translating? Well, that question is not necessary for people who are not interested in theory, but I am. So that's what got me thinking about it. And then, are there shifting narratives and dislocations in the market pointing to new observables that perhaps challenge the direction of translation studies? So these are the questions that I was building on, and the questions really lead me to a discussion of narratives. Now, discussion of narratives is always somehow related to science research, but it is not necessarily as strict as some, at least, experimental contexts. Now, some people will say that's not research proper. I would agree with that, but we live by narratives. And if I offer a reflection on narratives, that's because the profession needs to have that conversation for its own sake. And discussion of narratives sometimes do start with research. So this is an example I particularly like. That's Pierre Bourdieu, the famous sociologist. He's at a dance in Gascogne somewhere in the 1950s, and he's looking at the dance floor. This is a ball for single people, young men and young women. And he notices that some of the young men are dancing, others are not, but they roughly fall into two groups when you look at them. The ones dancing are the ones who've already been to big cities. They dressed up like you would expect people, in the movies in the 1950s to be dressed. They can do the new moves on the dance floor, whereas the ones not dancing are standing in the shadow, up the wall, and they're dressed in the traditional dress of the countryside. And that distinction between these two groups gets Pierre Bourdieu thinking about the structural change taking place in the French countryside, which was another wave of modernity entering simply the organic French community. Now, I think that looking at the dance floor and asking who's asking is an interesting question, because it seems that the theoreticians have been doing the moves for a long time. Now, the posthumanist perspective, this is this perspective where you look at the human-machine interface more closely. It appears to have been anticipated. In 1950s, translation was the language form and meaning. 1960s, that's the language form and meaning, but also impact of messages. More talk about what is sometimes called a unidirectional equivalence. So when you back translate the message, it's already something really different. Then there's talk about cultural factors, sociological factors. And just in the last decade, materiality of translation, eco-translation, so translation in the age of Anthropocene, biosemiotic theory of translation, a broad study of phenomena of translationality, and then, of course, showing, for instance, the German hermeneutic tradition, which is very strong in literary studies of translation. It has strong links with modern cognitive sciences. So why should the emergence of new phenomena cause surprise, skepticism from translators and translation scholars, and sometimes even a blank refusal to accept machine versions as translations? That's an interesting question. Now, I would say, and that's again a simplification, but I think many scholars would agree with me that the answer that the scholars and translators would give would be convergent with what may be called, well, it's because of the ELIZA effect. I'm talking about the famous experiment that's Joseph Weizenbaum, America, MIT, 1960s, and he comes up with an experiment. We would call it a baby chatbot today. Very simple computer script, simple by today's standards, but it allows a human respondent to have a conversation with the script using the typing interface, in which the script elicits information by identifying keywords and building simple sentences about it. So if you look at the screen, you'll see a fragment of a conversation, which is typical for interactions with ELIZA. And again, that's 1966. There is the human input. Men are all alike. In what way? The machine says. They're always bugging us about something or other. Can you think of a specific example? Well, my boyfriend made me come here. Your boyfriend made you come here. He says I'm depressed much of the time. I'm sorry to hear you are depressed. It's true, I'm unhappy. Do you think coming here will help you not to be unhappy? And now, in this experiment, you can see the script at work. In this experiment, the findings that Weizenbaum reported on showed that the humans communicating with the computer script maintained a sense of being heard and understood. And some even defended this impression and attributed background knowledge, insights, and ability to an ELIZA, which was really implied by the name of the computer program. And people were also told to talk to this ELIZA as if they talked to a psychologist. Hence, there's just a lot of repetition and elicitation. People speak and they have the sense of conversation. Now, the machine translation outputs, prompted by hundreds of millions of large language user models across the world today, they conjure up conceptualizations of hundreds of millions of imagined bodies that the users of such translations counterfactually interact with. So that's the reason why the community is sounding alarm. And now, of course, that means that we're in the middle of this huge discussion about the relationship between the mind and the body. Now, John Joseph from Edinburgh University, in his monograph about mind and body, says the following: language is a metaphor, a singular that stands figuratively for a complex of interactions involving many different parts of the body, actually of bodies, which is to say that it can never be contained within one person, though the metaphor of language allows us to conceive that it is so contained. The activity of the brain is expressed through the metaphor of mind, but like language, this metaphor has sprung leaks, which terms such as embodied, extended, and distributed attempt not to plug, but to point to. And now, technology-based augmentation of memory, or the mind-body, augmentation of the mind-body, this may appear to be in step with the translation theory, which has increasingly turned to embody the extended nature of language and materiality of communication. In a sense, some people would even say that technology today conspires to expose language as something that it has always been, and that's to say, a metaphor. But here is Joseph again. To call language and mind metaphors is not to dismiss them as myths. Concepts such as language and mind arise and spread because they work. So The mind-body problem is as topical as ever now that the mind, at least in the opinion of some of the post-humanist persuasion, appears to have separated itself from the body. Well, if not for other purposes, then certainly separated to generate texts which are presentable as translations that people can use. Now, metaphor, the problem of metaphoricity and the metaphors of translation, that's a very big issue in translation studies. Very many interesting discussions around that. This is a prominent example of Lawrence Venuti's work. So his critique of translators' invisibility and his condemnation of what he dubs the instrumental model of translation also pivots on the problems of conceptualizing translation, which is simply the fact that there are some there are some assumptions about metaphors there in place. So he says in his book from 2019, crowning many years of research, stop treating translation as a metaphor. Stop using moralistic terms like faithful and unfaithful to describe translation. But the interesting thing is that while most researchers would generally share the vision of Venuti, maybe they would not agree in details. Very interesting discussions there, but that would generally be shared. Yes, translation is metaphorical. The metaphor is there. There's a lot of misunderstanding when we conceptualize translation, and there's a lot of myths that people uphold when they talk about translation. But calls to view translation as extremely complex, they are far from accepted in discussions of translation, despite this effort of many years and many books and many discussions. Now, that brings me to the fact that these discussions, they take place in reference to narratives. Now, I think that modern translation studies is really a breakthrough in conceptualizing translation in terms of the academic tradition, in terms of disciplines, linguistics, literary studies, sociology, cognitive sciences, and more. But there are things that you can learn from earlier economies of conceptualizing translation, and that's something that I was particularly interested in for a number of years. And the pre-modern economies of translation theory can help us to appreciate that this objective part of our theory is implicated in historical material moments and the reference narratives that are used to navigate it. Now, this is an example that I like particularly. 1960s equivalence is a very important term in translation studies. And in late 80s, there is a consensus that there are problems with this concept. It should be unmasked as, if not fiction, then at least as a problematic concept. And there are good reasons to make that argument. And Mary Sloan Holtby charges against the notion of equivalence, presenting it as conceptually congruent with formal logic. If you read her book, this is a revised edition from 95 on the screen cited, she talks about box-like categories, neatly delimited text types, and rigid equivalence, identical denotations, which are good modifiers, but mostly if your frame of reference or if your reference narrative is formal logic of the Western university. Now, if you consider equivalence as a metaphor that is compatible with but not proper to formal logic or structuralism, the picture is different. So for instance, I looked at some older texts in which the notion of equivalence was broached. So for instance, 1765, Warsaw. And even though you have a discussion of equivalence there, you can really see the metaphor of equivalence, values, and transactions, so to say. The notion of equivalence didn't so much reflect systematicity of value stability, but systematicity of inflation because of the context in which the discussion was taking place. And that's a big difference. Now, Pym and Huao, in this publication that I've already mentioned, if they put on the front page and in the title, both translation and language learning, they are telling us something about the narratives that we have held to for a long time. Now, the classical practice of using translation as a language skill development method, both for skills in logic and public speaking, had a very strong position in the curriculum in non-professional context, and that for centuries, if not millennia. That only changed in the 20th century because of foreign language teaching becoming a mass phenomenon. And in a way, we're just bringing back an older economy. Now, so narratives are in place, they may be restored, they may be looked at in that sense, but there is clearly a situation in which we have this 20th century legacy, and this legacy is today a legacy in which you have the profession, the academic institutions, and what we would call in public policy documents, social actors, government organizations, multilingual organizations of government. Of course, the EU is the biggest phenomenon for the translation community in Europe. And you have a number of historical developments, one resulting from the other, which creates this fantastic ecosystem, which is a great achievement. And that ecosystem now faces something that just doesn't fit into the narrative. Now, this legacy is confronted with an uncertain future. Predictions are part speculative and they're part fiction because we just don't even have the data. And the situation is evolving very fast. So I said, it makes sense to look back. Call back the dragoman. Now, the dragoman is the translator slash interpreter slash secretary slash statesman slash foreign affairs ministers in the Ottoman Empire, but also in the borderland between the Ottoman Empire and what we would roughly call Central and Eastern Europe. So a lot of countries today are in a way heirs to this legacy. And if you look at this figure of the dragoman, who would be simply helping in the diplomatic missions that were going to Istanbul, to the capital, to deal with matters of war and peace, but also to negotiate commercial treaties. That figure would look familiar in many ways to the present day translation expert. So the trope, common trope, or a trope that we're familiar with would be that they would very often have to explain their worth. This is a quote. The king charged his personal court interpreter to join the envoy on his 1514 mission to Istanbul and directed that the envoy should not make savings on interpreters. This is a Latin quote, and the features in the interpretibus, adding that should Ivashka the Armenian, that's the interpreter in question, should he like that, he should be permitted to be a part of the retinue, a part of the household, so to say, of the envoy. Another familiar trope would be that the interpreters, their dragomans, hoped for a tenured job, and they looked in terms of their careers. This is a quote from Noel Malcolm, historian from Oxford University. The pay was not good during the apprentice years, but a fully fledged dragoman would occupy an important position in the Beyliat. This is really the embassy of Venice in Istanbul, with many opportunities for involvement in lucrative side business of his own, including commerce, so the position was certainly a desirable one. Another trope that is quite familiar is that having to explain their worth also meant, that there should be a different title, that they were appreciated when they were gone. When the treasured translator Jerzy was in Istanbul, Stanisław Koniec-Polski wrote to Sigismund III, how inconvenient that we should not have the Turkish translator with us. And again, that's something that translators, interpreter can really relate to, that they tend to be perceived only when things go wrong, and when things are really well, no one pays attention. That's thanks to their work. Now, if you look at this dragoman then, and what we hold to be the translator, interpreter, both clearly have unique skills and inside knowledge. But while the first one is a member of a household and is seen as bound by personal or clan loyalty and therefore partial, the other one is a member of the profession, seen as impartial, loyal to the professional ethos. The first one trusts their trust would always be in question, because a dragoman would be seen as negotiating a better fee, proverbially treacherous, or selling diplomatic secrets. Whereas the interpreter translation, their trust is based on objective credentials, education, qualifications, professional status, and recognition. The dragoman would be a risk taker with spectacular stories of success and force from grace. The expert translation is in high-paying employment, sometimes with diplomatic privileges and social security. So with the dragoman, you would pay for loyalty plus services. We just pay for services today in translation and interpretation, because the issue of loyalty had been regulated through professionalization. That's the narrative. Now, we really have a founding moment then in the 1960s, which changes the prototype of the translator and structures the narrative. It's the era of bureaucracies with the single original version, as in the European communities, professional organization, which is unprecedented. You have a promise that translation could become another topic to be studied scientifically. And you have careers in the academia which are consistently and for many years developed around the topic of translation. So we really have a new situation. But this narrative, when you look at it that way, is a narrative for a technocratic world. The previous world is a world in which, in absence of ways to verify, because look, the king, Jerzek, he was alone there. He could train someone. But how on earth could anyone check the ability or the jobs that Jerzek delivered for the king? The slide that was just cited. Today you have many experts, and the discussion is far more objective. With these resources, you could make promise that, well, coping with for amateurs, we will now solve problems that we understand. Because we have a preparation which comes a great deal of certainty in the outcomes, whereas that uncertainty of the past, well, it's gone largely. Because our experts have the skills to make the right decisions, and we are the answer to problems that normally happen when people translating or interpreting are not professionals. I think, if you look at least, if you look at it as a narrative, that this narrative would be the mousetrap in which we have found ourselves in the present moment. And that's because expertise, it turns out, may be modeled mathematically. Machine translation also builds on a history of uses and kind of a recognition. It tells us that the science of language and communication allows to reliably predict language forms, that the probability of error is smaller for many jobs than in human translation because the algorithm never gets tired, and that's true. And the machine translation comes with the promise that the risk of communication is not bigger than in human translation. And infrastructure is constantly evolving. So I think that what's happening now is that the profession is trying to get out of this trap. This is from my LinkedIn feed, and I'm pretty sure you've seen similar comments and posts. Following my previous post about why contexts matter, here's another funny example that I found today. A super literal machine translation. More proof that AI can't think, and that translation should be done by professionals, by humans. In 2023, the French Prestigious Association for the Promotion of Literary Translation releases this document, very interesting one. And in this document, calling for greater transparency AI, it also insists that the machine versions shouldn't really be called translations. So if I remember well, the phrase used would be sortie machine, like machine output. And at one point, an argument is made that if we were to open literary translation to this technology, we would deplete the resources of a language, because when you have a machine version and you're just supposed to edit this and post-editing, you will always go along with the nudges and the prompts from the machine because of anchoring bias. Now, I thought this was an interesting point to look at. So I took 94 papers by my students, not papers, but translation tasks that they did over 4 years. And I looked at these tasks because the text that I asked them to translate in a translation training program, the context of web translation, was a tricky one. Now, the text was originally in Greek, and it was posted on the web page of the Community of Rhodes. And there was an English version, and this English version was a good one, but there were some deficiencies to it. And correcting and annotating this for a couple of years, I always looked at this sentence. So what would the students do? So I knew the text pretty well. So have a look at sentence and table 2, and you'll see opposite, it's the bottom line, opposite the palace amongst the ruins from different historical periods, one can determine the ruins of the Catholic Church of St. John. It's understandable, it's okay. But many editors would say that, well, it's not really a natural way to say it. One can see the ruins, that's fine. But determine, this word really belongs to higher register academic language and so forth. Now, this is really Translator, it's probably done by a human. This text is rather old. This comes from the Greek borika nis na ξεχωρίσει, and it looks a bit like a calque. But the interesting thing is that most students would stick to this solution even though it was offending, even if this generated more problems for them. Another sentence I looked at was a sentence in which you really had, because this is a tourist text, you can think of it as a story or an instruction. You go up a lane, you look to the right, you see a landmark, and opposite this landmark, there's something else. So you have a story that people can actually enact. And that's human scale. And the information flow in this sentence, cognitively, was optimum. And some students said it's optimum, they kept it, and others didn't. Now, if you kept this, so you went along with the anchor, it was easier. And if you didn't, you created problems. So for both groups, for both sentences, the groups split at 7-3 for the anchor group. Evidence of anchoring bias obtained for negative and positive anchors. So the negative anchor is just this sentence I told you about, the one that there are good reasons really to reconceptualize. And I computed what is a tentative really metric. So I said, okay, I may build on the assumption that these sentences are equivalent because they're retranslations of the same text. So I can compute the number of characters related to the number of words, and I have what I will call equivalence ratio. And I can look at it and maybe even analyze it statistically. And these groups were very close to statistical significance. I don't think that statistics is important, but if it's close, with more data, you can do more with it, with the assumption of normality. And of course, there are other methods that you don't have to build on this assumption. So based on the tests, on a very simple preliminary test, I would clearly say that we have effects, anchoring effects on the data. So there was reduced problem accrual and related workaround effort if they corrected a conceptually burdening anchor on the one hand, and there was increased production volume if you non-reductively restructured human scale anchor information flow on the other, and both groups went along with the anchor, 70%, regardless of whether it caused problems or not. Now, what I think is interesting, at least for me, is that this could be well modeled. With more data, you can model cognitive anchoring results. So there appears to be really no ex ante reason why we should reject the possibility for anchoring bias effects. And I really think we might believe that if people believe that they can be modeled mathematically, I see really no reason why. And that's because we can develop language models for all kinds of purposes and all kinds of available data. Models can deliver results that are better than human results, but only humans can use models and give meanings to these models. to give meanings to these results. And that's because, and because of the ELIZA effect, we tend to blend the model with the use of the model. And that's the real problem. The model itself is not the problem. So my thinking is, in this argument, excuse me, the translation profession is perhaps at the moment where the economics has been just recently. This is a book by two economists, John Kay and Mervyn King. They explain how economics is trying to incorporate uncertainty into its narrative, really. Like the Met Office, a central bank must convey inescapable uncertainty to people who crave unavailable certainty. The Bank of England was the first to employ a visual method to display its judgment about the degree of uncertainty surrounding the impact of its decisions on its target, the annual inflation rate of consumer prices. The aim of the fan chart, and the fan chart is what you can see here on the screen, the line is what has already happened. The fan chart is a prediction of the future in different scenarios, factoring uncertainty. The aim of the fan chart was to shift the attention away from point forecasts, next year inflation will be 2.3, which had dominated macroeconomic forecasting, and to introduce a narrative of uncertainty in the general public. And of course, the problem is, how do you picture uncertainty in translating? I would show this to my students. These are 94 versions of the same sentence. And the equivalence metric shows you, these are really equivalent sentences. Some of them wouldn't be published immediately because of spelling. Some of them would be offending stylistically, but under certain conditions, that would be just enough. And that's the point. That translation reality always has to be interpreted in the context and the purpose of the text. But maybe we should picture a story. And the story I give to students sometimes in class is a story that I remember happening. So let me tell you this story real quickly. When I was a teenager, we went to a sister city in France. I was at that time in the folk ensemble. And on the last day, we stayed there for about a week. A very great time, a lot of visiting, very great concerts, wonderful audiences. And then there's a meeting at the mayor's office, not even the mayor's office, the mayor's hall on the last evening. 3 hours later, we'll be on the bus, we'll be going home. So this is really like a goodbye moment for us. There's a champagne for the adults. I'm not adult, I'm not drinking champagne, but everyone is in a very good mood and the setting is beautiful. And we're being, cordially received by the mayor, which is a very, very nice gesture. And the mayor, before proposing the toast, says a short speech, and that short speech happened to be interpreted by a lady who stands next to him. I don't know her name, but she's a figure I've been thinking about many times since that event. So he says things about our partnership between our cities, about the heritage of the region, and he starts enumerating landmarks, saying that he hopes that we will visit these landmarks. Now, I need to explain that I had been learning French for like 2 years, so I was far from any kind of being fluent, but I knew the future tense. And he was using the future tense. And I thought, goodness me, he doesn't know we're leaving in a couple of hours. But that wouldn't be a problem for the interpreter, in the sense that she didn't even wink. She just said that the mayor, she just gave us the version in which the mayor says that he hopes that we enjoyed, and she enumerated some of the landmarks that we visited and just mentioned others as the heritage of that particular region of France. She saved the occasion. So everyone was cheerful, and there was a toast, and the evening was wonderful. Now, what skill, what reaction, what intelligence, but what boldness, what cheek, what risk? She didn't know what the mayor was going to say in a moment. She saved him, but that could have developed in a catastrophe situation within seconds. So she was taking a lot of risk. Now, I don't know how she prepared. I don't know who she was, but today I think, wow, she was my first dragoman. And of course, I don't know if you like the story, but this story was supported by a picture. And some people would ask, was this real or AI generated? If this was real, that gives my story real credence. If this was AI generated, maybe I didn't really sound like an expert speaking about the real world, but a talker. That distinction is at the heart of my talk. We are very likely to situate the woman I told you about in the Parlement building. The Parlement building is, of course, the headquarters of the European Commission, Schumann's roundabout in Brussels. And this building is a fantastic building. That building is a place where translators and interpreters are doing a fantastic job, and that's a great achievement. But when I was there in my government years, I was surprised that the only artwork that I could see was abstract painting. There was never figurative painting with real people. And that's what I would call today the Parlement problem. The expert culture wants to be transparent and objective, and therefore becomes detached from what you would call the figure, a real person. That's the mousetrap. And of course, this was a response, a valid response to an earlier problem, which was the Charlestown problem. So again, I'm making this up, but anywhere you go in Europe, you're very likely to have a castle that was built by some kind of a Charles. It could be Charles IV in Prague. It could be Charles V, the Emperor Charles V. It could be Charles le Téméraire, Charles le Chauve, you name it. There are many Charleses, and Carolus in Sweden. And of course, that reality in which dragomans function was a reality of households, personal loyalties, and partiality. It's good that we have a reality that could be a step away from some of the problems that came with it, even for communication. But today, that edifice, the Parlement of translation, isn't exactly falling apart, but it's not the only building in town. This is an article from Anthony Pym, and we're really close to our finish. Anthony Pym says we should deconstruct translation trust. We have been thinking about translation trust in terms of the translator as expert. This was an essentialist notion of trust. The trust was being simply accorded to an expert because the expert was an expert. And this view of trust has been now revisited with an idea that perhaps we should propose a trust gradient because of the changes taking place. This thinking about trust is better suited to machine output use, that you cannot simply trust essentially, but you have to have an opinion about. So in the reality of post-editing, we need not so much a binary notion of trust, but there's a trust gradient. So the essentialist notion of trust has been brought forward from the vision of translation profession where multilingual knowledge was concentrated in the hands of a small group of experts. And today, that reality of translation being far more distributed. Anytime someone in a medical appointment uses a software to communicate in a language they don't really know, something like a distributed translation experience. Now, this more distributed view of trust corresponds to post-humanist perspective on translation, but it also gives justice to the variety of purposes behind translations, or if you want to phrase it in the idiom of the dragoman story, it is also, it gives justice to the variety of households to which the dragon may be attached. And I'm a Polish speaker. I may be using English, but for me, the translator is really too much. And the Polish word too much stands both for translator and interpreter. The word was borrowed into Slavic tongues from Turkish. You could be a translator and referred to as a secretary or by any other noun. There wasn't really a need for a specific designation, because while there was a problem, there was a question of lingua franca, there wasn't really a problem of lingua franca. In medieval Europe, each diplomatic mission, if you traveled east or west from Poland, you would cope because you would know languages that someone else would know, until there was a contact with Ottoman missions. So this word, too much, if you look at its etymology in Polish, it attests how the language question, which is a need of a lingua franca, became the language problem, and there was no accepted lingua franca. And that, of course, necessitated enlistment of specialists. And in standard modern Polish today, the verb tłumaczyć, tłumaczyć, means to translate, to interpret, but also to explain, to clarify, or even to justify. So in Polish you can say, in everyday language, czy możesz mi to wytłumaczyć, or czy możesz mi wytłumaczyć swoje zachowanie, which would mean, can you explain, even justify your action to me? So the ideal tłumacz would be an expert in people, not just an expert in institutions. And I'm coming back again to reference narrative. If your starting point is that translation and interpretation are neatly delineated categories, you have some kinds of discussion. If your point of reference is that too much is a reality which is far more synthetic, you will arrive, again, intuitively at different insights. Now, the lack of clarity in the present situation of the language profession has fed various narratives so far. So you have this stable and strong multilingualism boom narrative, and I don't think it's in any facing any major risk. Then you have the market correction narrative, which is, well, we were growing, now it's being corrected because some of this maybe was disproportionate, we don't need so many experts perhaps. And that, of course, includes this downward migration prediction. Then you have the AI bubble narrative, with some people saying, well, we need to call the shots on the real potential of artificial intelligence. And this is justified even if you look at the stock market and what happens to the stock valuation of AI companies. There's clearly a bubble there. Then you have a very important narrative, which I would call the market stratification narrative. That's a novelty. So far, you could say, because we have the expert profession, because we have the institutions, because we have this 20th century achievement, there is a spillover effect for anyone who wants to be interpreter and translator or work in the language profession. That is increasingly being called into question if you look at the data. If the data is showing us, and that's at least what I found in the previous Alice report, that small and medium-sized companies are suffering, freelancers are suffering, you have a rift. So small language services providers are facing the kind of difficulties that language departments, large players, are not really experiencing. Now, the narratives we have engage with the expert culture, and they put together analytical, socioeconomic insight to make sense of the present disorientation. But what I'm saying is, maybe we also need this other, too much dragoman narrative. The narrative of flexibility, agility, risk, trust, and attachment to specific people. This narrative would stress the embodied nature of communication. And it would be a narrative that you don't even notice very often because there's no single label to talk about the dragoman figure or the too much figure. It could be translator, interpreter, even prototypically, but it could also be a writer, an editor, the secretary, or a journalist. Lucille Davier's research in news translation shows us that you have many people who actually translate news, but they self-present as journalists, which was in Switzerland, which was, I thought, a very interesting finding. And this narrative would be kind of narrative that looks at history of translation, not just to see, to appreciate the kind of progress we have made. We have made progress, but we also have things to learn, actually to learn from the previous modes of thinking about translation, economies of thinking about translation, if we want to explain the present and the future. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maciej. I was just looking or waiting to see if there were any upcoming questions from the audience. Thank you so much for this great presentation. Well, as nobody from the audience is coming up with questions, I dare and ask mine, which is more like maybe I just need a bit of confirmation if I got it completely right.
Yeah.
So the distinction between the narrative of the translator and the narrative of the dragoman leads also to the distinction between translation theory and ideas about translation or theories about translation. So is what you call the dragoman narrative is it somehow anti-academic? It is, isn't it?
It is anti-academic, and it isn't anti-academic. It is anti-academic if you look at it from the point of view of the expert. Mm-hmm. And it is true that the expert narrative is largely about showing us the benefits of no longer being dragomans. And I take it. I take it seriously, and I think it is true. But at the same time, because of this rift, which is now emerging between the large organizations, large language departments, so segments of the market, and the reality of small providers making ends meet, I believe that we no longer need kind of a centralized vision of the profession. And then it is true that in a profession you have these ongoing discussions, or the recurrent discussions about, okay, so we have large organizations and small players, but we also have translation studies and translators. It's been 24 years since Emma Wagner and Andrew Chesterman published a book, The Dialogue Between the Word Face and the Ivory Tower. What does theory do? The translators need theory? That was essentially the book. And there's no answer to this question. So theorists say, yes, you need that. This because you can implement, you see everything more clearly. So kind of if you become also an expert in verbalizing translation, then you can be a better translator. Mm-hmm. And there are many arguments to the contrary. So there is a strong anti-academic sentiment, I think, in the language profession, which is valid. It is legitimate. But the question is, what is it valid for, in what instances, and where is it simply an expression of our ignorance? Because it may also be that. And if we are entering a realm where there's no longer, let's call it, social security around translation, perhaps we need to be more flexible simply in conceptualizing whatever happens, be more adaptive. So as an academic myself, I see all the reasons why academic work makes sense, is important, but I also see reasons why I should not expect my students to follow me anywhere I go as a researcher. One last thing to be said about that is it may be the case that to communicate well with the AI interface or with the large language model interface, you need to know much more about stochastic methods that is traditionally admitted in translator training. So rather than just having wonderful language skills in two languages, at least two languages, you need to understand statistics. And you need to understand the bell curve. You need to understand generalized linear models. You really need that, because if you know this, then you can interpret well the outputs that you're getting. But then you cannot do this as an amateur. You probably need some kind of training. So that would be, again, an argument that we cannot go too far with the dragoman. But the dragoman is not for academics. Dragoman is for ordinary people who today understand that there are these people in Parlement building and they're doing some great job, but they see no connection between this experience and, let's say, my cousin who just went to university to study languages. So that's basically the inspiration that I had.
Okay, thank you so much. We still, I think, don't have questions coming from the audience. But maybe if there are questions later, as the talk is going to be on YouTube, we can still keep in contact and answer them later. Great. Thank you so much. That was really, really great.
Thank you. And greetings from Wrocław.
And greetings from Padua to the whole Arqus community.